podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome back to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. And I had mentioned a couple of weeks ago how the 90s, the fashions, they're all kind of coming back into style. Now, it's one thing to talk about the clothes, the jeans, the kicks, all of those things. That's fine. That's fine. But there's also a resurgence of interest in 90s cinema, TV, so on. You know, there's a lot of talk where people are saying, oh, Friends isn't funny, or Friends is problematic, or, you know, whatever you want to say. But for its time and of its time, it was a phenomenon, and it was a big hit. But what I found recently, and in part because of, well, there's always been, and I did an episode on horror, there's always been a kind of horror trends that come and go, but you also get some it girls, if you will, that become very much, I guess, affiliated with the genre, right? So, for example, Mia Goth right now, although she has been in, you know, mainstream things like Emma, for example, she's, you know, known for the X series right now. You have someone like Jenny Ortega, who's in Wednesday. She plays Wednesday. She's now been in a couple of horror movies now. And, you know, one of them is our topic for tonight, and that is Scream. Now, Scream, if nothing else, besides the fact that it is durable, it is a long-lasting franchise. It's had its ups and downs and starts and restarts. But I think if nothing else, it can only be considered, just my opinion, the Gen X horror franchise. Now, some of you might say, well, wait just a darn second there, sir. You could say that Friday the 13th is. Well, Friday the 13th would have been late boomers as far as when it first came out. We're talking about Mrs. Voorhees, you know, early on. So what's that, 1981, 2, 3, somewhere in there? Pretty early on, right? 1979, you have something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So that would have been more for boomers. And, you know, obviously you would have had, you know, some late, well, you're in adolescence, and I guess it really depends on your family and what you are allowed or not allowed to see. So some of you 65ers that are out there listening to the podcast, you might be like, no, Friday the 13th is the jam. Or perhaps more likely, again, just my opinion, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street, I will tell you, I saw for the first time. So I had a TV in my room. My room was up in a converted attic. And it was a black and white TV, and I've always been a night owl. And part of it was because my mom would go from work right to school. She was getting her associate's degree at the local community college. So I'd be home alone, and what would you do? You watch TV. And I had a TV in my room because eventually I'd get tired and I'd go up to my room and want to go to bed. But I couldn't always fall asleep if she wasn't home, right? So I'd have the TV on. So I'm telling you, I have been watching like the late night shows since I was a little kid. And when I had that TV, we moved into that apartment between like 8 and 12, it was like 8 years old, 12 years old. I was already consistently watching Letterman, for example, you know, never got into Carson as much, like some of it. And then Arsenio Hall was like a big deal for a while. But anyway, I'm completely digressing. The first time I saw A Nightmare on Elm Street was on that little black and white TV up in my room, and scary, fascinating. But I think that the reason I'm starting with A Nightmare on Elm Street is that you have Wes Craven. Now, Wes Craven is one of the great horror auteurs of all time, right? I think it's unquestioned his. I put him, Sam Raimi, Tobe Hooper, and Cronenberg, different styles of horror, certainly all of them. But Wes Craven is a master, just an absolute master. And it could be everything from you know, Last House on the Left, brutal, brutal. That was 78, 9, somewhere around there. The Hills Have Eyes. And then you have what was initially considered to be his first masterpiece, if you will. And that was the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And that was something that he conceived, wrote, and directed. He was not the director on all of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. He was screenwriter and producer on all of them. However, he only directed the first one. Maybe the fourth one? New Nightmare, he definitely did. But talking about Gen X, so you have some people who are on the cusp in that first Nightmare on Elm Street, right? You have Johnny Depp, who was just outside the range. He was born in 1963. He's almost one of ours. And Heather Langenkamp, who was 1964. Again, depending on your metric, I know I say it every episode probably. Some people will say 64 is an X. Some will say the last boomer. However, on Nightmare on Elm Street 2, the cast jumped in age, which sometimes happens when you're trying to, you're trying to add some gravitas or acting chops, but you have people playing teenagers, right? So the second one, I think the lead, I'm forgetting his name now. He was like 59, something like that. So completely boomer, right? And that, number 2, not my favorite of the franchise. Now, again, because of my age and big fan of metal, I think that my personal favorite installment, other than the original, is, of course, Dream Warriors. But think about this. So this is where I'm saying, like, Wes Craven, his movies, Gen X horror franchises that cover all the different bases, I think, right? So Dream Warriors, you have Rodney Eastman, 1967, and he was in 3 and 4. You have Bradley Gregg, 1966. You'd know him if you saw him. Go check it out. You'd be like, oh my gosh, I know that guy. And then finally, you have Patricia Arquette, who's 1968 in Dream Warriors. So these are all very much Gen X actors. Here we are. So what's also interesting is that Wes Craven had another movie that was a comedy horror movie. So he's always had elements of comedy in it, right? Freddy Krueger had a wicked sense of humor. Now, mind you, terrible psychopath killer, undead, dream occupying killer. But you had The People Under the Stairs. And really the lead in that, character's name is Fool, right? Is played by Brandon Adams, born in 1979, who you will also know as Jesse from the Mighty Ducks and Kenny from The Sandlot. Just so firmly Gen X actor in some seriously Gen X franchises when you really think about it. So that's a little bit of the Wes Craven piece and how, he was in his late 40s when he really blew up big, and that was Nightmare on Elm Street. So at the time, and I didn't know this until I was doing some of the research, is that New Line Cinema was called the house that Freddy built. It was basically kind of a minor distribution house until A Nightmare on Elm Street. And then I think you look at that all throughout the 80s, 90s, and I think New Line is still an active production company. Freddy Krueger is the one to put it on the map. I think the budget was a couple million, and it made $57 million in its first outing, and then obviously spawned a franchise. So Wes Craven mastered his craft, but if you think about it, A Nightmare on Elm Street was filled with every trope that had already kind of been established. Most, I guess, primarily from, Friday the 13th. Have sex, do drugs, all of that, you're dead meat, right? And that was also the case with A Nightmare on Elm Street. So it's kind of the moralistic tale, and the more immoral you are, even though the killers themselves are also immoral, the first people they're taking out are the ones who are the worst behaved, right? And you always want to have your final girl who is either virginal or very powerful, whatever it is, right? But that's when Wes Craven, who penned the Nightmare on Elm Street series, comes across a script by a gentleman by the name of Kevin Williamson, born in 1965. Not only is Kevin Williamson known for writing Scream, but also I Know What You Did Last Summer and a little show called Dawson's Creek. This guy was putting together the kind of language. His linguistic choices were very much reminiscent of the way that we spoke, probably the way that we still do speak. And there's really only one other that I purely look at as one of his contemporaries. And that's probably Joss Whedon, as far as writing characters with a particular style, a particular voice that's representative of a generation. And that's why I think Scream is not only one of the best horror franchises, but why it speaks so powerfully. And in some ways, why it would be, I think, interesting to our kids. I think in part because it's somewhat relatable. Now, I haven't seen the latest 2 installments, just full disclosure, okay? But the reason this all popped into my head was, and I will say my oldest son is none too pleased by this because he's our oldest, and the oldest always has it the worst. I can't deny it. It's absolutely true. And he wasn't able to watch anything. Like, it just, I think part of it is that I saw so much horror, gore, sex, all that really, really young. And I've just been very cautious about kind of shielding them from that until they're age appropriate. So certainly I was already watching horror movies when I was much younger than they were, but we always said that you had to be of a certain age to watch, based upon the rating. So if a movie was PG-13, damn it, you needed to be 13. So now my oldest is like, so wait a minute, my younger siblings get to watch rated R movies. Well, with us in certain situations, right? And he's right. So anyway, the Scream franchise comes up, and I may have mentioned a couple weeks ago, my daughter is now dating. This is going to just take years off of my life. And she's like, Dad, really want to go see Scream. Really want to go see it. And boyfriend, he wants to go see it. And, I've heard some people at school say you really have to know some of the lore if you're going to go see it. Can we watch it? Now, I haven't watched it in a minute, and I'm like, you know what? Okay, we'll watch it together. So my oldest is like, oh my God, you're going to let him watch it? He came in and out. He's like, Meanwhile, the kid who's now old enough to go to see rated R movies in the movie theater without any assistance whatsoever, goes and sees Cocaine Bear with his friends. Like, this was the whole guys' night out. Like, we're going to go see Cocaine Bear. Elizabeth Banks directing. That's just odd. And Ray Liotta's last movie. Cocaine freaking Bear. Anyway, so we start watching the series. And there is lore, and there is a thread, and I don't know. She started to give spoilers the other day in the car on the way back from Mass, of all places. We're all like, la, 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 we can't hear you. Please don't give it all away. And she did give one piece away, and I'm not going to give it away here, so I definitely have to see it. But let's dig it a little bit to the cast here. So this is a who's who of Gen X actors who have all been in some pretty big vehicles even outside of this, right? Outside of Scream. So, of course, you have your lead. You have Neve Campbell, 1973, as Sidney Prescott. She was also known for Party of Five, of course. You have David Arquette, so another Arquette in a Wes Craven joint, 1971, as Dwight Don't Call Me Dewey Riley. Rose McGowan, 1973, Tatum Riley, also known for Charmed and many other things. Ski Ulrich, 1970, as Billy Loomis. He was in As Good as It Gets with Nicholson and Helen Hunt and Greg Kinnear. Matthew Lillard, 1970, Stu, also notice, really, he has been the voice of Shaggy since he did the Scooby-Doo movies. So in Casey Kasem passed, he became the official voice of Shaggy, which is amazing to me. He's also in one of my guiltiest pleasures, and we will do a guilty pleasures of both music and film and TV. She's All That. Sorry, it's a masterpiece. We have Jamie Kennedy. Jamie Kennedy, 1970, as Randy Meeks. He's also like the Mask 2 or Son of the Mask. So he was a stand-up comic or a sketch comic. I have no idea what happened to Jamie Kennedy. Now we have Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore, 1975 as Casey in one of the most iconic openings of any horror movie. You have Liev Schreiber as Cotton Weary. Now these names all are so well crafted and well designed and all have meaning. And we may or may not get into all of it, but Cotton Weary is such an appropriate name. It's such a well-crafted script. And then you have the oldest member of the primary cast. Now, I'm not talking about dads and stuff like that, because you also talk about Gen X icon. The Fonz himself, Henry Winkler, is the principal of their high school. How freaking cool is that? The Fonz. Courtney Cox, though, she's the elder of this. 1964, she is Gail Weathers, and I think many of us saw her for the first time. Dancing in the Dark music video with Bruce Springsteen. She was just a kid, gets up there, dances with the boss. She was on a show briefly. Oh my gosh. The Misfits of something where they all had superpowers. Do you remember that? That was very brief. Oh my gosh, I have to look that up because the Misfits, oh my goodness. Hold on a second here. I got to look it up. I figured she would be right on the first page here. Courtney Cox, oh my gosh, I forgot. She was in Masters of the Universe with Dolph Lundgren as He-Man. Misfits of Science, is that what it is? Hold on. Misfits of Science, 1985. And guest starring roles, wow, she has been around long enough to have been on The Love Boat, on Murder, She Wrote. And that's right. She was Lauren Miller, Alex P. Keaton's girlfriend on Family Ties. Huh. So anyway, you have Courtney Cox. She's the elder one who is a borderline Xer, just like a few people here. Now, I'm not going to get into like the entire cast then of like Scream 2, but you think about another, it's like more like a who's who. You start Scream 2 with Omar Epps, Jada Pinkett Smith. You have Sarah Michelle Gellar, Timothy Olyphant, Jerry McConnell, who, of course, was in Stand By Me. I mean, it's just amazing that they had some of just the who's who of young actors at the time really coming into their own and becoming the top stars. Now, within all this, you also have, now not in the Scream series, of course, but, you know, your Leonardo DiCaprios are becoming, you know, big things around this time. You have Matt Damon, Ben Affleck. You have all the, you know, the Kevin Smith, the View Askew universe. Like all those things are happening. You're Freddie Prinze Jr. Because then you can go right into I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is also Kevin Williamson. And let's see here. Dawson's Creek, Vampire Diaries. Let's see. But I Know What You Did Last Summer. So Jennifer Love Hewitt. Oh my gosh. Also Party of Five, Sarah Michelle Gellar. She is, you know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and also those Grudge movies, top notch. And she was Daphne along with Freddie Prinze Jr. and Matthew Lillard in Scooby-Doo. Oh, and Gina Cardellini, is that her name? She's Hawkeye's wife, she was Velma. So anyway, Ryan Phillippe, Freddie Prinze Jr., so then Ryan Phillippe, that takes you over into, Reese Witherspoon, and Reese Witherspoon will get you to Kiefer Sutherland because they were in Freeway, and Kiefer Sutherland always gets you back to Kevin Bacon. Anyway, the point of all this is that the Scream franchise, I think, is so durable because it's in many ways, I guess, relatable, because the characters also know, and this comes back to Randy Meeks. So on the big night of, I guess it was Halloween, was it Devil's Night or Halloween? And they're really hitting the crescendo at this point. Like the bad guys, and sorry, spoilers, however, 30 years later, this is just a little bit less than 30 years. Stu and Billy are prepared for their grand finale, if you will. So that night, there's a party at Stu's house, but Randy is talking about, what, you don't know the rules? And he begins to explain what the rules are. So the fact that they're saying it out loud, that's what made it so clever. That's what made Kevin Williamson, just to me, it's screaming, I think, our sensibilities, our sense of irony, our sense of, yeah, we're self-aware enough. We know what's happening. It doesn't mean that we're still not scared. It doesn't mean that we're still not invested or engaged, but we know exactly what the tropes are of a horror movie. Don't have sex. Don't do drugs. Never say, I'll be right back. Right? All of those things. Virgins don't die. Right? Those are the key things. And we all know it going into it. And if you've ever been to a movie theater with a particularly lively crowd, and you should hope that you have had this experience, people are yelling and screaming because they know, like at the screen, at the actors, because you know when someone says, I'll be right back, we should split up. Like all of those things, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Now, what's great about Scream is that the bad guys also know the rules. So if you think about it, you go back to that night, the party, and Stu, who is dating Tatum, says, hey, baby, get me some more drinks from the fridge out in the garage. He purposely separated her from the group, right? It's brilliant because they're playing with it. I also want to point out that in that opening scene with Drew Barrymore as Casey is really when you first got the very notable horror movie catchphrase of, want to play a game? Before there was Saw, it was, well, I want to play a game. What's your favorite scary movie? Right? Oh, Friday the 13th. Who was the killer in Friday the 13th? Jason. I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer. It's so good. It's so good. What's even better is that when you go to Scream 2, they're in film school. And they're doing like a film theory. And Randy's in class there, right? And Randy is with Cece, who is Sarah Michelle Gellar. And you have Timothy Oliphant's character, who I am forgetting his name at the moment. And it's such a obvious name. And I'm going to feel stupid about it because I'm not going to remember what it is. I just had it up on my screen and I lost it. Scream 2. Timothy Oliphant. Well, actually, this is perfect because I just want to. Okay, so Mickey. Yeah, Mickey. So I mentioned Jerry O'Connell, right? And you have Timothy Oliphant. But you also have, and I had completely forgotten about this until I watched it again recently. You also had Rebecca Gayheart. Portia de Rossi is in this. Heather Graham, who is playing herself, playing Casey, who is played by Drew Barrymore. You have Joshua Jackson, who is best known as what? Pacey from what? Dawson's Creek. I mean, Tori Spelling as herself playing Sidney Prescott, which is played by Neve Campbell. And then finally, this one blew my mind. And also a Gen Xer, Luke Wilson was playing the fictionalized film version of Billy Loomis. Just amazing. Like it's all in jokes and it builds and it builds. So clever. And it's legendary. It's absolutely legendary. Now, I'm not going to get much deeper into, the different movies and all that. It's more that I think it speaks to me in the way that they verbalize things, right? And it was also a reflection of what was happening at the time. So you're going to be like, what are you getting at? So you all know, because we all know about Columbine, right? That happened in 1999. Okay. And the killers, I'm not going to use their names, were both like what we would call Zennials, right? Born in 81. If your cutoff is 77, they would have been just as influenced by many of the same things that we were, right? And I think about what influenced them. Games like Doom, for example. I remember playing Doom on a laptop, on a PC. It was very reminiscent of the time. And to think about Columbine happening in 1999, and I graduated in 1992, I mean, that's not that long. 7-year difference, And that's what keeps coming up. And that's, how do I put this? We already knew that there was blame for media for things that happen. So you go back to the PMRC and saying that music needed to be controlled, right? There was the uproar about Ice-T and his band Body Count and the Cop Killer song, right? But Scream came out in 96. Scream 2 came out in 97, right? So before Columbine. But both sets of killers, again, spoiler alert, were leaning heavily on what they knew would be a societal reaction to their actions, which is always trying to find ways to not blame perpetrators of terrible crimes. Because obviously, if they're committing such terrible crimes, there's something wrong. And we don't know what it is. Maybe it's the abuse that they themselves have experienced, childhood trauma, or a undiagnosed mental disorder that is running rampant, that makes it so that they can't control their actions. There's always a way to try and push the blame away or push it back on society. So when you look at Billy and Stu, right? Billy and Stu are talking about what they can blame it on, right? Or they're actually going to try to pin it all on Sidney, right? Going to blame it all on Sidney and that it was all the setup and all that. But then you have Mickey, who's over in Scream 2, who's saying, I'm just going to blame it on the movies. And I couldn't help myself because I've influenced too heavily by these horrific images that I've seen. And now I'm a killer. But then Laurie Metcalf's character, who is his co-conspirator, was like, I never felt that was going to hold up in court. And she shoots him dead because she's a cold-blooded killer. Anyway, but that's where the real cleverness of, I think, Scream, which in many ways, I guess, was prescient and was kind of a precursor to what we would see with a place like Columbine, where you are seeing teenage perpetrators committing horrendous acts, right? Not that many years removed. So the things that were blamed, I don't think they blamed Scream, but they certainly blamed Marilyn Manson, and they blamed video games and all of that. It was an excuse or a reason that something was fundamentally broken in those young men. That's where even, Stu and Billy in Scream, Billy has a reason, a motive, not a particularly strong one, but does he really need to have a strong motive? He's a killer, right? And that is that Sidney's mom was the town whore and broke up his parents' marriage. And that then his mom left his dad and by extension left him. And someone needed to pay, and they started with Sidney's mom, pinned it on Cotton Weary, and now they were going to, pin the rest of it on Sidney. But they also said that Stu really didn't have the same motivations. He was just a psychopath, and his whole bit where he's like, my mom and dad are going to be so mad, was just so crazy, so delusional, so outside of what would be a rational thought in that particular situation. A, he's just killed a whole bunch of people. B, his best friend and co-conspirator stabbed the hell out of him, where he himself is likely going to die, and all he's thinking about is his parents are going to be so mad. That's really clever. That is really clever writing. But then you go over to Scream 2, and of course, Mrs. Loomis, played by Laurie Metcalf, it's revenge. So now it's revenge on top of revenge, right? So it was Billy's revenge on Sidney for her mother causing his mother to leave. So he kills Sidney's mom, and now he has targeted her. But she in turn kills Billy, so now Mrs. Loomis has to kill Sidney because Sidney killed her son, and you don't understand a mother's love, right? It all seems reasonable, and I say that with quotes, right? It seems reasonable, the motivations, but they're really not. And that's what I think makes it a fascinating look at the human psyche and how that is very reminiscent of things that unfortunately we read in the news. Don't read the news. Don't do it. It's awful. It's awful. And if it doesn't make you angry, it will make you sad, because there are some fundamentally broken people in the world that desperately need help and aren't getting the help that they need. And sometimes that will end up reaping terrible situations. So the things like Scream, unfortunately, it probably doesn't raise to the completely dramatic level of, wearing a ghost face mask, but I'm sure there have been things that have been very, very similar. I think about the story that was up in New Hampshire where a mother and her daughter were home alone in their very rural house. Husband and father was away on business, and a group of 3 or 4 teenage boys broke into their house while they were sleeping, began to stab them to death, whereas the 10-year-old girl then lied on the floor, played dead. They came over and wanted to make sure she was dead, stabbed her again. She stifled her own scream, just swallowed it, didn't flinch, and just laid still until they left, while her mother was dead in the bed. That was real life. I don't know if, I forget what year that happened, but it was somewhere in this time period. And you can't make excuses for that. And that's where Scream was basically saying there's no justification, no matter how much you come up with some kind of alibi. Because you can go back and you can say, Friday the 13th, okay? Mrs. Voorhees had righteous vengeance because in her mind, if you were a camp counselor at Camp Silver Lake, then you were potentially a bad person, so bad that you would let a mentally and physically challenged little boy die in the lake, drown in the lake because you're off messing around, right? She felt completely justified in her actions and saying, this place is not going to be reopened. And anyone who comes here, I'm going to kill because you young people, you're drug addicts, you're sexually deviant, you're irresponsible. Therefore, you need to die. What happens? No one knows that Jason is actually a supernatural being who then sees his mother decapitated in the final, the pinnacle, the peak of the movie, right? There's another word and it's not striking me at the moment, but the big payoff, if you will. And he now has to pick up the revenge thing, right? So it's a little bit revenge for his mother, but then also it's revenge for himself having been killed, right? They're still the bad guys, although Jason was originally an innocent victim, right? But then it gets subverted and becomes something darker because vengeance is not a good thing. So then you have a Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger was a child rapist and murderer, right? Who now is getting revenge on the people that he felt unfairly burned him to death. Okay. That is some street justice. Okay. That is vigilante justice. And again, vengeance is a bad thing. But now you have vengeance trying to get revenge for vengeance. What a ridiculous cycle of just detriment, just destruction of human life. And I think that we have that in real life. That's why the social commentary of horror movies still remains so powerful. Saw, the Saw series. Jigsaw's whole thing is his own, I guess, appreciation for life, right? Cancer diagnosis, all that, and finding his own suffering, that there's all these people out there who have, in his estimation, created suffering in their own minds, whether it's stress or their jobs, they're having an affair, whatever it is, right? Drugs. He has determined that you people don't appreciate the good that you have. So therefore, I'm going to put you into some really extreme situations that if you get out of it, and by the way, Jigsaw's traps, very, very difficult, but you could survive. You would be maimed. But he felt that people needed to be more grateful and more thankful for the things that they have. That's pretty intense. I mean, it's different than the sci-fi horror movies. I mean, there's not a lot of that in, the Predator series, for example. I mean, Alien does have some political, sub commentary, but I think for the most part, your Nightmare on Elm Streets, your Friday the 13th, a little bit of, the Cenobites, like Hellraiser, like that whole series. But that's, psychosexual deviancy. That's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing. Candyman has some righteous revenge in there. Can't deny it. It's just a real thing. So anyway, I just wanted to take a little bit to talk about Scream, the greatest Gen X horror franchise. But do you agree with that assessment? Is it the greatest Gen X horror franchise? I think it is the epitome of it, and the writer, the cast, I'm sure some of the crew just screams Gen X. So what do you think? Let me know. How can you let me know? You can let me know by emailing me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, 5-star comment, 5-star reviews, like, comment, share, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.